what we've seen over the last few days is the end of the Labour Party's relationship with the white working class. It's finished, it's over, it's done.
Responding to the mass protests and riots recently in the UK, Elon Musk wrote on his platform X that civil war is inevitable. Do you agree with him?
No. But what I do think we're going to see is sustained inter-ethnic conflict. I don't think it's full-scale civil war, but I think we're going to see increasing clashes between ethnic groups, Hindu and Pakistani, Hindu Muslim, and I'm afraid between whites and everybody else. What we've really got to understand is that we've had a public policy which has tried to keep enforced silence. I'm an example of it. My own cancellation. There's been a deliberate attempt ever since Enoch Powell's River of Blood speech, the language of which was overblown, but the points that he made were absolutely true and are being proved true even as we speak now. Unfortunately, the decision was taken that you simply shut people up. If you do not debate a question, if you do not discuss it, if you do everything you can to make it undiscussable, then I'm afraid it's like a sore in the body. It's an untreated wound. It becomes deeper and deeper and more septic until finally it bursts horribly to the surface. And I'm using a deliberately foul metaphor because what's going on now is foul. Threatening to burn people alive, which is what it amounts to, is monstrous. That sort of rioting is monstrous. But the fact that it's monstrous doesn't mean that there are not real reasons for it. And it's all very well. Starmer is a natural authoritarian. And one of the things we need to talk about, he presents himself as a policeman. We've never had a prime minister who presented himself as a policeman before. We had a great prime minister, Robert Peel, who invented our police force, but with the deliberate idea it was not by force, it was not by violence, it wasn't by water cannons, it was by consent. It wasn't neo-military, it wasn't an army of occupation. And Starmer, of course, represents that worst, that as in so many other ways, continental tendency. And he is every single thing he says, he does, everything that Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, does, makes things worse.
Do you think that multicultural societies can survive without authoritarianism?
Generally not. I mean, the great example is Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, an intensely ethnic country in the Balkans, positively flourished under a communist dictatorship. It was the poster boy for communism under Tito. The moment you try to introduce democracy, then there is the problem, because each group then pits itself against every other group. And can we just again, very seriously, Stephen, we're talking about a tragedy. We're talking about a profound world-scale tragedy, which is why Elon Musk's language is not inappropriate. The Britain I grew up in was the most peaceful, the most gentle, homogeneous society that has ever existed. Why we did not need identity cards, why there are extraordinarily low levels of crime, such high levels of public trust. That has been destroyed. It has been deliberately destroyed by Tony Blair and New Labour with this absurd notion that they were going to force us to become multi-ethnic for our good. They were going to rub the noses of the whites in the dirt. And sorry, we've got to understand that. It is an act of such inconceivable national self-harm.
You mentioned rubbing the noses of the whites. I think you're referring to a comment about rubbing the noses of the right in diversity, which was allegedly a comment that a Blairite politician made at the time. And it's interesting, you talk about high trust society. Lee Kuan Yew, the Singaporean leader, he wrote about coming to Britain, I think in the 1940s, and he wrote about how amazing it was that we were able to have some kind of trust box or some like newspaper box or something where you kind of take a newspaper and you put the money in. And he just thought this was an absolutely exceptional, amazing example of civilization. And then he Singapore famously is a multi-ethnic, multicultural country, and he was very successful in making that country succeed. And many would argue he did that through authoritarianism. So do you think that this is inevitable in Britain today?
Right, let's be quite clear about Lee Kuan Yew. It was absolute authoritarianism. What there is in Singapore is a very, very high level of economic freedom and absolutely no serious level of political freedom or freedom of speech. And the risk is we go or try to go down that route. And again, it's easy to see why we might. As I've said, Starmer represents an intensely authoritarian streak. Again, people get very confused here. Because Starmer was a human rights lawyer, they think he's sort of all soft and cuddly, because human rights are really nice, aren't they? But what we've got to remember is that the sort of human rights that Starmer represents are the rights only of minorities. This is the terrifying thing. Democracy has been stood on its head. Democracy means the rule of the majority. It's now completely inverted to mean the protection of every exotic minority you can think of against the majority. And the only way you can protect them is by aggressive policing, the sort of behaviour that we saw from Mark Rowley, Sir Mark Rowley, the as it were, overnighted, in every sense of the word, overnighted Metropolitan Police Commissioner. When he's asked a question about two-tier policing, what does this arrogant do? He strikes the head of the microphone out of the journalist's hand. The sheer contemptuous arrogance. Because again, what we've got to understand too, Steve, is that we really do have two-tier policing in every possible way. It's not simply that a Muslim demonstration will be policed differently from white, then there's no such thing as the EDL, but let's use the word for just the moment. It's not simply that it will be policed differently, but the entire language has been perverted. Have you heard constantly this word community? Now, what is this wonderful community whose values we are preserving are? What they are sub-ethnic groups, not simply Bangladeshi, not simply Muslim. They're extraordinarily Romani, the most persistently anti-legal, as it were, anti that sort of society that we just both described now, the picture of England in the 1950s. Those are specially protected groups. The police handle them with kid gloves, as we saw in Rochdale, as we saw in Leeds. Not only do they handle them with kid gloves, they actually negotiate with them catastrophically as groups with community leaders, unelected, self-generated. There's only one group, Stephen, that is not allowed to do that, and it's the white working class. And this is why they are rebelling. They are not allowed to have a community. They are not allowed to have their community leaders consulted. Again, you see, there are huge questions behind this. One of the things, again, I want to put two or three of these big questions because nobody else has done it. What we're seeing now is a movement in the political tectonic plates on a scale that has not taken place since the end of the First World War and the replacement of the Liberal Party by the Labour Party. What we've seen over the last few days is the end of the Labour Party's relationship with the white working class. It's finished, it's over, it's done. Of that entire red wall, I will predict there will not be a single Labour seat left in it in a future general election. The question is, where does that vote go? Traditionally, it would go to the Conservative Party. The greatest Conservative Prime Minister, who isn't Churchill, it's Disraeli, says the Conservative Party is the national party or it's nothing. We need, I'm going to say these words out loud, we need an English national party. Why is it such a wicked thing to say? Because there's a Scottish National Party, there's a Welsh National Party. They're both rabidly pro-immigrant and anti-English. Are they not? I mean, the evidence of Scotland is overwhelming. The entire thing is driven by a bizarre sort of anti-Englishness, a deliberate separation of two peoples who have got along extraordinarily well to their extraordinary mutual benefit ever since the Act of Union. That's been ruptured. So there is this huge English question which has to be confronted. Tam Dael, back in the old days, he put it simply constitutionally, it was known as the West Lothian question. Why is it that Scottish MPs can vote on English laws and English MPs can't vote on Scottish ones? But suddenly it's much, much bigger. Are the English to be allowed in this extraordinary torment of ethnicities? Are the English to be allowed to have their own? Which then raises the whole question of what's the relationship between British and all of these other things, between British, in other words, all these hyphenated identities. What is the relationship above all between British and English? We are overwhelmingly the largest group, and we are the one that's least represented. And what's happened instead, of course, is that Labour, and this is the moment again at which I predicted this in all my recent videos have been saying, the Labour Party has ceased to be the party of the working class, and it's become the party of the rampantly powerful, entitled public sector, the sort of person who is represented by the overnighted, overpaid, overindulged Sir Keith, whatever he's called, Mark Rowley. That's what the Labour Party represents, and it is the potential of a police state.
I just want to come back to this tweet from Elon Musk. I think it's really important about civil war. And there's a few things I want to ask about the tweet. First of all, Elon Musk isn't British. And many American, I know he's not American either, he's South African, but many American commentators and non-British people have been using extraordinarily hyperbolic language around what's going on in the UK at the moment. And some may accuse them of even egging it on with this kind of language. And we don't want to condone the violence or the riots, and we don't want to encourage people to do these things. So are you concerned in any way about foreign interference in the UK right now, where you've kind of got these bad actors, perhaps in America and elsewhere, who are almost encouraging these people to go out and riot and to protest in this violent way?
Yes, and there is an element of proper concern about that. Look, I share your concern. I've been talking pathetically as an old man about the world that I remember, the world of growing up on a non-violent council estate, in which there was a competition to keep your privet hedge neatly cut, in which the women, and again, this is something else that's not been talked about, women have been present in these demonstrations. This is not the usual group of football louts. Once I know I was brought up in this world. It's really run by the women. The men can do the big barrel-chested stuff. The people who really control it are the women. When they join in, you know something serious has happened. The seriousness is real. Language like civil war is absurd. To fight a civil war, you need weapons. We do not have weapons. We are a disarmed society. Civil wars in the past have always involved, since the 19th century, they actually involve elements of the army, or divided armies, as happened in Ireland in the course of the First World War. When Ireland is divided, a government terrified of what's going on allows both the Unionists and the whatever one wants to call them, the Irish Republicans, actually to arm, the Catholics to arm. So you have two armed camps. We've nothing like that in Britain. That is not going to happen. But what is going to happen is increasingly nasty, sporadic, ethnic violence. What is going to happen is increasing political distrust. Remember, this government may have 2/3 of the seats in the House of Commons. It's elected with the votes of whatever it was, just over 1/3 of those who actually voted, and only 1/5 of the actual electorate. It's the lowest turnout in an election since whenever. And remember again, the moment New Labour comes in 1997, political participation falls off the edge of a cliff. It had been at consistently high levels right through the 20th century, after the beginning of full democracy, at the end of the First World War. In 97, it falls off the edge of a cliff. I've been blaming Labour a lot. I also want to blame my own party. My own party's refusal to contemplate what Labour did, my own party's refusal to alter the dreadful constitutional changes which embedded all of these attitudes, all of this kind of superiority, all of this notion that there's a received higher doctrine, that there's no such thing as borders. Borders are a bad thing. Human rights mean we're all really the same. That a Rwandan, a second generation Rwandan born in Wales is as Welsh as any Taffy. All this is lies, lies, lies. And it's because there's been lies, lies, lies from every part of the spectrum that people do at political spectrum, that they're doing what they're doing now. The protests are awful, they're disgraceful, they're shocking, but unfortunately, when people are shut up, when they're not allowed to debate publicly, when there aren't rational means of objection, you get irrational ones. It's our political class that's reaping the whirlwind that it's sown. Every brick began in Westminster.
You mentioned earlier the riots in Leeds, but there were also race riots in Leicester a couple of years ago. It seems, and of course we have to mention as well, the violence from Islamic extremists like the murder of David Amos, the Manchester Arena bombing, the 7/7 attacks and so on.
This is too long to recite.
But I want to ask whether you think that we have seen the return of ethno-religious violence to the UK, to English politics, that we haven't seen since the English Civil War.
The English Civil War wasn't ethno-religious. It was the English fighting amongst themselves with a considerable measure of tough Scots coming in and wiping the floor with us to begin with. What we're seeing is something we've never had in England since really the earliest Middle Ages. The key to understanding why these groups are so dangerous, everybody talks, and of course there is this ridiculous word, Islamophobia. Everybody talks about it essentially in terms of religion. I think there's something else which is much more of a key. What we've now got in Britain are actual tribes, and a tribe isn't a group of individuals. English law is there to deal with a group of individuals, but it's not a group of individuals. In a tribe, the individual, in a way that we are completely unfamiliar with in England, is subordinate to the group. That is why there are all the accusations, in the East End of London and whatever, of false voting and all the rest of it. Because the individual, a ballot, to our eyes, is something you do as an individual. There it's not. It's something that you do in response to communal instruction. Again, the extraordinary business of Gaza being an issue, not simply in a parliamentary election, but in for heaven's sake, local council elections. All of this represents a fundamental subversion of how we've done things in England. Not simply since democracy, but since the very beginning of representative government. Remember, we used to be that world again that Lee Kuan Yew was talking about, that I was talking about. It goes way, way back to Magna Carta. It goes way, way back to the 12th, the 13th, and the 14th centuries. And it involves this notion of the governed having the right to participate in government. But that depends on a series of individual transactions, a respect for history, a respect for tradition. All of that has been thrown through the window.
You mentioned Magna Carta. I was recently in Salisbury Cathedral, where they've got one of the copies of the original Magna Carta. And surrounding that document is all sorts of what I would call quasi-propaganda around migrant rights, refugee rights, and women's rights, saying that the Magna Carta was essentially a very progressive human rights document. What do you make of that?
It just deserves laughing at if it weren't so terrible. But you see, you made exactly the point that I'm saying. Our notion of a sovereign parliament, of a system of parliamentary democracy has been completely perverted into the idea that what it's about is not the protection of the rights of the majority, but the protection of the rights of increasingly alienated minorities. Again, can you imagine a Norman baron worrying about the rights of refugees? And the idea is simply demented. And the fact that the church, again, can we be very serious? The fact that the Church of England is engaged in this naked and foolish propaganda. Again, they bear a very, very large measure of responsibility. The Church of England used to be central. I called it English Shinto. It always used to be called the Tory party at prayer. Now, of course, it's the extreme left ranting. But in the days when it was the Tory party at prayer, it was the English doing something very important, Stephen. They were worshipping themselves. And they were actually worthy of it. And it's this deliberate destruction of our self-respect, the regard to that history. England, remember, invents modernity. These enormous changes that lead to increased life expectancy, increased prosperity, better health, better dress. We're the first country to abolish endemic famine and so on, that leads to mass literacy. They all begin here. And it looks, perhaps, as though they will end here.
Mass migration to the UK has been occurring at least since the days of Blair. And after the Second World War, we started to see the beginnings of this.
Tiny. It was tiny. In comparison with what's happened, it's really important, Steve, we get the proportion of figures right. The scale of millions since 1997 is not simply unique in modern times, it's unique throughout our history. Even the great population movements of the Roman period and the post-Roman period and the so-called barbarian invasions, the numbers, even as a percentage of the population, were on nothing of this scale. This is a unique development's the wrong word. This is a unique happening, and therefore it's got unique consequences. And the fact, again, that it's been done without consent, that it's been done with a deliberate suppression of debate about it, all, as it were, exacerbates. The problems would have happened anyway, but the way we've gone about doing it, with that sense of subterfuge, of contempt for the majority. Do you remember that awful woman who even Starmer couldn't give a cabinet position to, Emily Thornberry? Her absolute contempt that a man who works, drives a van, dares to have the St. George's flag. That sneering contempt. Why is the Welsh dragon better? Why is the St. Andrew's cross better? It is this extraordinary self-contempt of a particular part of the English radical elite. It was recognised completely by George Orwell, and what it's happened through the Labour Party, through this extraordinary perversion of human rights law, through the creation of the nonsense of the Supreme Court. It's become, and this again is what's so terrible, it's become a ruling ideology that nobody believes in outside this charmed circle. The very great historian, my colleague and friend Neil Ferguson, has said the West is going the way of the Soviet Union. We have these monolithic political structures, and the scale of the general election victory of the Labour Party on that unbelievably actual fragile electoral foundation shows it. We have these political structures which look immensely like the old Soviet Union, immensely strong, monolithic. You've got complicit police forces and all the rest of it, but the population don't believe them. They don't believe what they're told. And of course, they're failing catastrophically economically, because again, why should we have talked about it? But this kind of state structure, with its vast bureaucracy, its multitude of quangos, its huge briberies to various sections of the electorates, is intolerably expensive. Our economy cannot sustain it. And every single thing that the new Labour government has done is making it worse.
You managed to predict my question without me asking it, but I did want to ask about the lack of consent towards this policy of migration. And this goes back a long time. This goes back to the beginnings of when we started to open the borders. And you're right to mention it was only tens of thousands, but it was still, unprecedented numbers of people coming from abroad, from ex-Commonwealth countries. And even at that time, in the 50s and the 60s, when we began this project, MPs were saying that this wasn't going to have a significant impact, and many MPs and the public were against immigration to Britain. And despite all of these protests and consistent votes against immigration, immigration has only ramped up, particularly under the Conservative Party. I want to ask just a very broad question. What has been the impact of mass migration to Britain and to England?
The events of the last few days. Of course, it's not been the only one, and he's quite wrong to suggest that all immigrants are problematic. See, I'm very old-fashioned. I believe, again, that our history may... Can I turn the question round slightly? Because we've really talked about what the consequences have been. The entire interview has been on what the consequences have been. Can I suggest what the remedy might actually be? Because that's something we should be talking about. Britain, remember, was never simply a single nation state. When we were founded in 1707, which is when it really happens, with the union between England and Scotland, we were multi-ethnic from the very beginning, because as well as England and Scotland, there was Ireland and there was Wales, although Wales was not recognised as a separate kingdom. So we were multi-ethnic, but the ethnicities were clearly, there were not very many differences between us. We all spoke more or less the same language and so on, had more or less the same values, but there were genuine differences, and the first football internationals are actually played between England and Scotland. So how was it all contained? Well, there were really two different sorts of nationalism. There was the nationalism of Scotland, Wales and Ireland, which were typical European nationalisms. You know, you've got national dress, you've got kilts, you've got national poets, Burns, you've got national music, harps and bagpipes and all the rest of it. But England was different. England was a country without national dress. England was a country without, in any simple sense of the word, a national poet, although I suppose you've got Shakespeare, and instead we were about believing in our values of law, of property, of justice, of parliamentary government, all of those things. Now, what's happened is, of course, that the way through all this, it seems to me, would be a reaffirmation that being British has always been hyphenated. And essentially used to be for going abroad. Back home, you're English, Scots, Welsh, Irish. But what we've got to do, we've got to reintroduce that notion of a hyphenated identity. But one identity has got to be dominant. And that is the commitment to the institutions of a free, responsible, liberal parliamentary state that was the essence of the old England. That is immutable and unconditional. And it's because we have not required all immigrant groups, most of them, again, see, we shouldn't be having this conversation. So many immigrant groups come here passionately wanting to embrace, those particularly from Eastern Europe who've known the horrors of communism. They come here, they desperately, people from China, from Hong Kong, they come here, Jews come here, desperate to embrace, to participate. But we've got to make sure that all immigrant groups do that. It's got to be unconditional. We cannot have groups saying, we are different, we are going to remain isolated, do not approve of you.
One do that when we've seen immigration on the scale that we've seen, millions and millions of people coming in, and where you have sort of quasi-ethnic conclaves within British cities where you have large populations of ethnic communities or ethnic minority communities congregating in one place, and it doesn't seem that they want to integrate. They have no interest in doing that.
It's absolutely true. Therefore, the first thing you have to do is to stop them recruiting themselves from abroad. We've got to stop the notion that even arranged marriages confer citizenship. Germany doesn't let that happen. In Germany, the mere fact that you marry somebody does not give you German citizenship. We're going to have to introduce that rule. Because the thing that... Remember, the thing that keeps communities different is either when they marry each other, again, that cousin marriage thing, or whether, again, usually as an extension of cousin marriage, they marry abroad back into the communities that they came from, which is why, of course, they never actually integrate. Why what's going on in Lahore or the Punjab matters, or the Middle East matters to them more than what's going on in England. The thing we cannot, it's an abominable thought that we would actually practice mass expulsions or worse. But what we could and should do is simply stop replenishing this difference. Outlaw cousin marriage. Outlaw the rules on spousal rights. We've got to begin with that. Of course, that would require a political revolution. That, again, it requires a sort of discussion that we're having now. And of course, the consequence of cousin marriage is something else nobody dares to talk about. The levels of physical and mental disability in some immigrant communities. Because if you have cousin marriage, you have genetic defects. And again, these things have to be talked about. But of course, they can't be talked about when the Labour Party is in power, because they demand that all groups, as it were, have equal results. They refuse to acknowledge human difference. The whole point about the left is it denies human reality. It denies the fact that we're different. It says we all ought to be the same. And it tries, and the only way that you can make people the same, you will remember there's the famous story of the Greek tyrant Procrustes, who had a bed on which you were fitted, and if you were too short, you were stretched to fit it, and if you were too long, bits were chopped off until you did. And the Labour Party's policy on as it were, so-called community relations is exactly that. It's a policy of brutality and folly in refusing to recognise difference, and above all, folly in refusing to manage difference.
I have to ask this question. It's the kind of language you're using would be very controversial to some commentators, to many on the left. This phrase far right has been bandied around by Keir Starmer recently, and accusations of racism and so on. Why do you feel so confident in saying what you're saying and not sort of worried about being described as a racist or far right and so on?
The term racist has become absurd. Listen to what I've been saying, as I hope you have been doing. Have I not been vehemently denouncing violence at every single...
Of course you have.
No. But listen carefully. Have I not been trying to say that there are enormous, very significant numbers of immigrants who are remarkable and make a remarkable contribution to our society? Have I not been trying to look at what might be a way forward in our history? The fact that we were always bicultural, that we had two identities. We had a juridical identity as being British, and we'd separate English national, English Welsh, whatever it was, and that offers the way forward. Again, the absolute refusal to talk about these things, the left's sprinkling of the word racism around, is exactly why we're in the mess we are now. And the fact that it's also applied so shockingly unevenly. You may have heard, of course, Diane Abbott denouncing racism. Can I remind everybody, Diane Abbott's deeply racist remarks about blue-eyed, blonde-haired Swedish nurses transgressing into her sacred NHS. The shocking levels of direct, blatant racism, totally uncalled out, because in the left's position, the only group that, as it were, can be racist is the white, and this is this shocking, not simply two-tier but multi-tier. The reason I'm doing this, the reason I'm speaking as frankly as I am, is because I care about my country. I'm an old man. I'm not going to live very much longer. I have nothing particularly to lose. I'm not aiming for political office. The only thing, I suppose, to being really pretentious, I'm playing the part of either a Cassandra or an Old Testament prophet, and no doubt prophets are always without honour in their own countries. But until more people are prepared to say this, and of course, why do I think my analysis is right? Well, I've got quite a lot of experience and I'm quite a good historian. On the other hand, I'm not sufficiently arrogant to think that it's the only one automatically right. What I will say is, until we can debate this freely, without the charges of far right being flung around, until we can actually recognise a common citizenship which entitles us all to talk about these things, we will get nowhere. And can I remind you what a certain chap said when he stood on the doors of Downing Street? That he would govern unburdened by doctrine. And the first thing he does is to lurch immediately to a far left position. And sorry, we've got to... The language is, if one actually looks at the damage that's been done by the right in the world and by the left, I'm afraid the damage that's done by the left piles up legion high Yes, there's Hitler, but against Hitler there is Stalin, there is Mao, there are the abominations of dictatorships in Latin America. Everywhere one looks, we've really got to stop this mutual abuse. And I'm not criticising Stalin as a person, which again the left loves to do. I'm criticising his ideas. The only way human beings improve, and this was the wonderful thing about England, we pioneered what's called inductive reasoning. That's to say, if you've got a problem, you don't reach up to principles. You don't talk about far right or far left. What you do is you look at what's going on and what has gone on, and you try to work out what might be a better way of doing it. That was the glory of England. That's the glory of our science. That was the glory of our universities. But it depends on freedom of speech, which again, the left loves to diminish. And of course, you can see them itching to bring in an Islamophobia law that will effectively render one group in our society totally undiscussable.
You mentioned Starmer. I want to ask about Starmer's response to this whole crisis. How do you rate his first month as Prime Minister, and how does he compare to Tony Blair?
The enormous difference is Blair had flair. Starmer has no flair whatever. Moreover, Blair was elected genuinely on, I didn't share in it. I mean, let me reminisce a little how I reacted on election night 1997. I knew what was coming, and I spent most of it with my head down a lavatory, being exceedingly sick after drowning my sorrows in champagne. I knew what was coming, but at least there was that sense of openness, of something different. What Starmer represents, although he's constantly used the word change, he simply represents an intensification of what we had before. The Tories did it half-heartedly. He does all these dreadful things with positive enthusiasm. He's also very much less intelligent than Tony Blair. He absolutely lacks Blair's skills at communication. He's wooden, he's dull, he's a second-rate mind. It's even worse than somebody like Yvette Cooper. You know, Yvette Cooper's quite extraordinary. She contrives both to be mousy and schoolmistressy at the same time. It's very difficult. What else can you say? And what moments like this demand is a degree of open-mindedness of, yes, slam down hard on the violence, but say, as Blair brilliantly did, I feel your pain, as Clinton did, I feel your pain. I mean, what was striking about both Blair and Clinton, not unlike Hillary, unlike Starmer, they understood their opponents. They knew how to use language that appealed to them. They knew literally how to bridge gaps. Starmer immediately resorts to the iron fist, the mere language of the policeman. Can you imagine a prime minister advertising that he was a public prosecutor? This sounds like something out of Eastern Europe, doesn't it? A chief of staff who was the enforcer within the cabinet office, Sue Gray, with an awful smell of Northern Irish politics around her. In other words, it's this extraordinary partisanship, whereas Blair, I think, was deeply partisan, but was he clever at concealing it? Was he clever at the embracing the big tentery, which of course Starmer is hopeless at?
What's your greatest concern about Labour over the next 5 years?
They'll continue exactly as they are. What could be? Has there been a worse beginning to a government? And also, it's the deliberate lying, the utter clumsy transparency of the thing. Again, his Downing Street speech with all this language of being unburdened by doctrine of public service and all the rest of it. It makes Margaret Thatcher's invocation of St. Francis of Assisi look like a job description. The terrible thing is, it leads constantly to contempt, to distrust, to that sense we're being lied to. I'm a classic old-fashioned historian. I spend the whole of my life checking evidence. I loathe what's going on online with false truth and all the rest of it. But it's not surprising it happens when every official statement, you've really got, again, you have to do criminology on it, actually, to find out what it might mean and what might be behind it. The complete contempt for the electorate, the total contempt. These are terrible things. Again, I speak as a teacher, somebody who spent so much of my life teaching in two rather good universities. Your duty as a teacher is to get people to think. It is to give them information. It is to encourage them to debate and to arrive at good conclusions for themselves. A good politician does that. A Churchill did it, and even at some moments, a Thatcher did it. A Blair did it. What we're seeing now is mere, shallow, nasty, and profoundly dangerous authoritarianism in a very bad cause.
I want to ask a bit about the Tory party. Do you have any faith in these Tory leadership contenders to reunite the Tory party and win the general election next time?
I think there is surprisingly, there's a considerable display of talent. I think Kemi Badenoch, I think particularly Robert Jenrick, they're very able people. I think they're beginning to have some serious thoughts. I and many others are trying to plant more serious thoughts in their minds. But what's happened over the last few days shows not simply the magnitude of the task for the Conservative Party, but the magnitude of the task for the country. I also think it shows very strikingly the inadequacy of reform. I don't think Nigel Farage has covered himself in glory in the last few days. Much more intelligent questions have actually been asked by Tice. But once again, there's a fear, isn't there? Because these areas of necessary debate have been simply excluded from polite discourse for so long. There's a profound reluctance to address them. There's a fear, and it is the Sovietization. It is again what Ferguson is talking about. An entire political class that purveys a false narrative, a narrative of the wonders of multiculturalism, that we are the most tolerant society. Well, we are one of the most tolerant societies, but as though that in itself would enable you to continue. To break it, which is what I'm saying has to happen, will require extraordinary will and extraordinary intelligence. Even Margaret Thatcher had to grow into it. You will need a politician at least of her stature. Remember, breaking with the post-war economic consensus, which is what she did between 74 and 79, represented in many ways something as big as what I'm suggesting happens now. The Conservatives were, by 1974, were completely embedded in Keynesian economics, in the notions that you controlled inflation by prices and incomes policies, in nationalisation and all the rest of it. And it took the will of Thatcher on the one hand and the intelligence of Sir Keith Joseph and the Centre for Policy Studies and the whatever to come up with the ideas, and of course in the background the great figure the great figure of Friedrich Hayek acting as a kind of intellectual lighthouse pointing the way forward. But it took 5 years. It took Thatcher nearly 10 years to begin to turn round the ship of state. These things are not done easily. And of course, what will make it extra difficult are these indigestible islands of population that we've been discussing. It is a terrifying task. I think you can well understand why Rishi washed his hands of it.
Can the seeds of British decline be found in the great reform acts of the 19th century and Disraeli's portrayal of Lord Salisbury in the Second Reform Act of 1867?
No. On the contrary, they were responsible for the creation of that Britain that I talked about, because what those reform acts did was to incorporate the hitherto excluded into the body politic. Dissenters, my ancestors, I was born to a Quaker family, the working class again. like Sir Keir Starmer, my father was a toolmaker, and I was born in a pebble dash semi. I've just been seeing photographs of it taken by a kind friend. And what happened, and which is why Britain was so astonishing, we did all of those things without revolution. We did that process of incorporation without revolution. The enormous challenge now, and this is what I've been trying, we've gone on forever, what I've been trying to talk about, the enormous challenge we face now is to repeat that process of reintegration and, dare I say it, re-civilization. Victorian Britain wasn't all that peaceful. There were terrible riots. There was the sense of the unreformability and the violence and the impoverishment of the bottom half of the working class. That process of political reintegration, of the creation of things like trade unions and friendly societies and nonconformist churches, all of that was as much part as the incorporation of the working class and women into the electorate as the creation of that world of the early 20th century and of the immediate post-war period. If we don't repeat that exercise, we are lost. We are finished.
How do you assess Lord Salisbury's premiership in the late 19th century with his philosophy of splendid isolation abroad and quasi-reactionism at home, where he essentially said we need to slow things down, we can't be too progressive, we need to sort of take things very incrementally?
Well, isn't that sensible? And again, it's not simply Salisbury. I mean, remember, the relationship between Salisbury and Disraeli is obviously a very complex one. But the person who gets it right is Disraeli. Disraeli says Britain is a progressive country. Well, he always talked about England. England is a progressive country. The question is not that there will be change, but what sort of change? And he said, do we change according to our own rules, history and practices, or do we import foreign principles of rational liberalism? And of course, that's exactly what the 1945 government did. It imported preposterous notions of socialism or neo-communism, Marxism in short. What Blair did was even worse. It imported these extravagant doctrines of really late 18th century French liberalism. And they of course, are wholly destructive. They deny the existence of the nation state. They deny the importance of history. They deny the importance of tradition. All of the things, the importance of family, all of locality, all of the things that give us rootedness, that give us belonging, that enable a new generation to build on the work of the old, not to destroy it, but to do better. And this is why I hope desperately that the Conservative Party is able to do that. Because there is an equal right, let me again be frank, there is a profound danger on the right of our politics. It seems to me that what has happened now means that this huge swathe of the electorate is vulnerable to a real, let's use proper language, a real far-right takeover. That would be as destructive as anything that Starmer is doing. There's stuff going around on the web now in which you get some intelligent young man saying, nothing worth preserving here. In other words, a revolutionary right that matches the semi-revolutionary left. That would be hopeless and that would be awful. What we've got to try to do, what I hope, occasionally, atheist that I am, I'm driven to praying. You can see how bad things have got. Is that we revive that conservative notion. That notion that the way we always did things, the thing that enabled England uniquely, Britain uniquely of any European country in the 19th century, to modernise and to incorporate all these different social groups without vast unrest and revolution. We were unique in doing it. It's an extraordinary story. We've got to recover that. But it was on the basis, remember, the great changes were fundamentally conceived of as being conservative. fundamentally conservative, because they was built on this idea that the old isn't, as again Blair constantly said, the old is something just to be thrown away. The old is a fertile soil. It's the thing from which new growth comes. In the same way as Geoffrey Chaucer, again, way back at the beginning of this whole process, said, from old books, new science springs, new knowledge springs. And that should be the task of the Conservative Party, that reuniting of old and new, of past, present and future. It's shown itself, I'm afraid, to have failed badly. Our entire hope, our only hope as a nation, is that it recovers that confidence and its ability to act in the way that it should, and leaves the extremes of right and left, the revolutionary rejection of the past on both sides, pushes them aside and returns to the proper British English way.
I'm a great lover of biographies, and I have a sort of maybe naive hope in great men of history. I enjoy reading about them. One man I'm fascinated in is Bismarck, and I just wondered whether you had any thoughts on him and his on the consequences of his chancellorship of Germany, his reuniting of Germany onto European politics. And I wondered, and just separate to that, can a great man save Britain today?
It needs a great man, or indeed a great woman. Or indeed, do you know what? I wouldn't care if it was a great transsexual. But it needs somebody with that extraordinary capacity that grasps events. Again, one of the things that's I prefer not to talk about Bismarck. I think Bismarck is a catastrophic figure. He is finally, by no means the only one, but one of the contributors to the horrors of the 20th century, with all his genius and whatever. The Prussia that he creates was a monstrous thing, and we do not wish to emulate it. But I do believe in great men and great women. I do believe that, again, that wonderful phrase in Shakespeare, there's a tide in the affairs of men, but you've got to seize it. This is a moment which is terrible, but it's a moment at which I've tried to explain all sorts of things are changing. The great man or the great woman sees that, understands it, and it's like being a surfer. Rather than being drowned in that great wave, you ride it, you crest it, you triumph over it. But it needs extraordinary qualities. I'm afraid I don't see them. But there are not many great men and there are not many great women. It's why we have that unique term, so-and-so the great. They are very, very rare. We've been, again, let me stop being quite as pessimistic, we've been extraordinarily fortunate in our history. Again, we've forgotten this. It's actually why there are queues of immigrants on the other side of the channel. That we have had a uniquely fortunate and lucky history. But every so often, luck does run out.
And just one final question. Do you view Henry VIII as a great man of history?
Oh yes, and he seizes something improbably small, doesn't it? Falling out of love with one woman and into love with another woman, and reconstructs the power of the English monarchy on the basis of it, and finds the geniuses like Thomas Cromwell to do it for him. What he did. Is this extraordinary mixture of the creative and the desperately destructive. I do think that one of the extraordinarily important things about Henry, which again relates directly to present circumstances, he pioneered the idea of putting religion firmly under the heel of the state. It's called Erastianism. I think this is a very good thing. There is nothing worse than the world in which you let religion dictate politics, which unfortunately, of course, is the basic principle of Islam, which is why we see the monstrosities of Iran, Afghanistan, and so on. We've in a sense, we need a Henry VIII at this hour, but it would not be the church that he sorted out.
Thank you so much, David, for joining us. Appreciate your time.